She stood barefoot in the dust, her baby pressed to her chest like a shield, her name stripped from every memory that once made her human. They were auctioning her like cattle, her child just a bonus in the bid, and no one flinched. No one saw a mother. No one cared. Until a quiet Lakota warrior raised his hand. He didn't know her story, her scars, or even her name. But in that single gesture, everything changed. He didn't save her because she was innocent. He saved her because she was unseen. What followed wasn't a fairy tale. It was war, against the law, against whispers, against the silence inside her that kept her from calling herself worthy. And when the law came knocking to steal her son, she stood up not as someone's victim, but as her own legacy. This is not a story of rescue. It's the story of a woman who refused to be erased, and a man who believed healing was louder than bloodlines. Watch till the end, because some stories don't just deserve to be heard, they demand it. She didn't remember falling asleep, only the jolt of waking to a baby's whimper pressed against her chest and the sound of iron chains dragging over dirt like a death knell. Her blouse was damp with milk and sweat, the baby's tiny fist clutched around the necklace she wasn't allowed to wear anymore. Around her were women, some with children, some without, none with names worth calling out anymore. They weren't prisoners, not officially. But they weren't people either. In this settlement on the edge of the frontier, where the law was just another man with a rifle, women like her were bartered the way you'd trade tobacco or whiskey. She was 19. Or maybe 20. She didn't know anymore. Time had blurred somewhere between the cabin she escaped and the dirt-floored shack where they kept her until the auction. That's what they called it. She'd heard the whispers, the men laughing about how fresh she looked. With the baby, you'll get two, one of them had said. She'd stopped crying weeks ago, not because she stopped being afraid, but because fear wasted water. Every tear her baby didn't drink was a drop closer to death. And now, as they pushed her onto the crude wooden platform, her arms tightened protectively around her child, her body instinctively angling to shield him from the sun, the eyes, the price tags. The sheriff stepped forward first, oily voice curling around the crowd like smoke. "Gentlemen," he drawled, "today we offer something rare. A mother. Strong hips, quiet mouth, and a child just under a year. Fine stock. Loyal. Won't cause fuss if you feed her enough. Let's start the bidding." She kept her head down, refusing to meet the faces, some drunk, some greedy, all wearing the same expression, ownership. Her baby stirred, fussed. She rocked him instinctively, murmuring a broken lullaby she remembered from her own mother's hum, long before that woman vanished into the maw of war, poverty, and a nation that never cared. The first bid came from a merchant, face red from sun and drink. 200. Then another. 250. With the baby. "Course," the sheriff chuckled. "You think we'd split him?" Laughter rolled. She stood straighter. Not out of pride. Out of fury. If she was going to be sold like livestock, she'd at least make them remember her spine. More bids followed. Her heart pounded with every number. The baby whimpered louder. She kissed his forehead and whispered, "Sure, my love. Mama's still here." She couldn't save herself. But she'd die before letting them take him. The price climbed. Men shouted. The sheriff's voice rose. 500 to the man in the back. "Do I hear 6? Then silence. Not a pause. A shift. A tension that cut through the rowdy noise like a blade. Every head turned toward the back of the crowd, where a lone figure stood, tall, unmoving, clothed in buckskin and quiet power. A Lakota warrior. Not dressed for ceremony, not armed for battle. Just present. Watching. He didn't speak. Didn't shout a number. Just lifted his hand. Slowly. Deliberately. Palm out. The sheriff hesitated. Laughed nervously. "Sir, this ain't a show. It's a sale." The man didn't move. Just kept his hand raised. The crowd murmured. A few scoffed. "He don't even have money," someone barked. "Savages ain't allowed to bid." But still, he stood, hand lifted, eyes locked on the woman with the baby. She felt it. Not pity, not desire, but recognition. Like he saw something beneath the dirt, the cracked lips, the wild eyes. And her knees buckled. Not from weakness. From hope. The sheriff muttered, "Fine. What's your offer?" The warrior stepped forward. Slowly. Reached into the pouch at his belt and pulled out something small. A necklace. Beaded, handmade, woven with colors not found in this place. At its center, a carved ivory piece in the shape of a hawk. It shimmered with age and reverence. The sheriff blinked. "What the hell is that?" An elder in the crowd gasped. "That's sacred. That's a mourning piece." The warrior held it forward. Offering. No words. Just the weight of history in his hand. The sheriff stared. Then nodded. "Deal." The crowd erupted. "You serious? For a necklace?" "She's not his kind." But it didn't matter. The sale was done. The sheriff stepped aside. "She's yours, then. Take her." For the first time, the woman looked up. Eyes wide. Baby clutching her dress. Her lips parted but no sound came. The warrior didn't touch her. Just stepped forward, nodded once, then turned. Not a command. An invitation. She followed. Her legs trembling, her body clutching the baby so tightly he began to squirm. Behind her, the crowd jeered. Called her names. Said she'd made a trade from one kind of savage to another. But she kept walking. Away from the block. Away from the price tags. Toward something she didn't yet understand. The road ahead was long. Unforgiving. But with every step, her baby calmed. Her heartbeat slowed. And the Lakota warrior, still silent, still strong, walked ahead, not owning her, not saving her. Just leading the way. And for the first time in years, she felt something beneath the fear. Something small. Something alive. Something like beginning. She had named the baby Thomas after no one in particular, only because it was the gentlest name she could think of in a world that had never known softness, a name she whispered in the dark when fear clawed at her chest like wildfire, a name she could say with her eyes closed and remember that not everything in her life was stolen, because this baby, this child nestled to her ribs, was hers, not by law or permission, but by blood, by fight, by every sleepless night she endured alone in a storage shed behind the saloon where she scrubbed floors with her back aching and belly swollen, praying no one would notice she was with child until it was too late for them to make her disappear. Her story hadn't begun on that auction block.
It had started in a quiet Kansas town, where she was born to a mother who died too young and a father who drank too much, a man who saw her not as his daughter, but as an extension of his own failure, someone to trade, to marry off, to rid himself of before she cost him more than her silence. She had been 16 when he handed her over to the man in the fine coat with gold on his collar and ash on his breath, said the man would give her a better life, that he'd feed her, dress her, even educate her. But the man never promised those things, not to her, not aloud. Instead, he took her to a cabin on the edge of the plains, where her name was used only in orders, where her voice was ignored, and where loneliness became her only constant. She remembered the first time he touched her, how she froze, not from shock, but from knowing deep in her marrow that no one would come for her, that this was it. This was her life now. A traded good, a girl behind glass, taught to smile and keep her head down and be grateful she had a roof. When she found out she was with child, she didn't tell him right away, partly because she didn't know what he'd do, and partly because some foolish part of her believed that maybe, just maybe, the baby would soften him. But Thomas didn't change him, only made her more vulnerable, more trapped, more valuable in a currency she never consented to. She wasn't sure what broke her finally, what made her slip out in the middle of the night, with a torn blanket and half a bottle of milk, walking for miles with blistered feet and a screaming infant, hiding under trees and crawling under fences, praying for sanctuary. But she made it to the town barely, only to be picked up by a man with a badge and an empty conscience who took one look at her and said, "There's always someone willing to pay for a young mother," and locked her in a storeroom until market day, feeding her just enough to keep the baby alive, mocking her every time she asked for water or mercy, and laughing when she begged him not to sell them separately. For days, She rationed her food to her child, tore up her own dress to make diapers, and sang lullabies she barely remembered from a mother whose face was already fading from memory. Because what else was there to hold on to when you were a girl no one claimed and a mother no one respected? And through all of it, Thomas never stopped needing her, never stopped reaching for her, his tiny hands searching for comfort that she didn't even believe she possessed anymore. When the auction day came, she thought it would be the end, thought that maybe she'd be bought by someone kinder, or maybe not. Maybe she'd be separated from her baby and left with nothing but the sound of his cries fading into the distance. But what she never expected was the man in the back, with eyes like stone and posture like an oak tree, who didn't bid with words or gold, who simply raised a hand and changed everything. And as she followed him out of that place, with Thomas clutched against her chest and her heart too shocked to speak, she couldn't help but wonder what kind of man offers sacred things for broken ones, what kind of heart trades heritage for strangers, and whether she had escaped one cage only to step into another. Yet as the dust settled around them and the sun dipped low, she felt Thomas rest heavier against her body, not with hunger, but peace. And she thought, maybe, just maybe, she hadn't been bought at all. Maybe for the first time, she'd been seen. The walk from the auction block to the edge of the town was only 20 steps, maybe 30, but to her it felt like miles, each footfall pulling her farther away from the noise, the eyes, the humiliation that had wrapped itself around her shoulders like a second skin. And though her body moved forward, led not by command but by the silent rhythm of the Lakota warrior ahead of her, her mind stayed trapped in that moment when his hand had risen and everything, even her fear, had frozen. He hadn't looked at her with pity, hadn't stared at her body the way the others had, hadn't even acknowledged the baby clutched to her chest except for one still glance that saw not a burden but a bond, something sacred, not shameful. And that confused her more than any cruelty ever had, because cruelty she understood, control she'd learned to navigate. But this quiet, this respect, it was foreign, unnerving, and terrifying in the way that only kindness is when you've been taught that kindness always comes with a price. She kept her eyes low as they left the edge of the town, passing a saloon, a post office, a stable, each building etched in memory as places that had ignored her existence. And yet now, with this man walking before her, strangers stopped to stare, not at her, but at him, whispers rising like smoke in the distance, thick with disgust, suspicion, and thinly veiled hatred. What's he doing with her? They let him buy white girls now. A savage and a used-up whore. Someone muttered behind a shuttered window, and she flinched, not at the insult to herself, but at the slur aimed at him, because whatever he wasn't savage. He was silence forged into flesh, a presence that didn't ask permission to exist. And as they reached the trail that led away from the settlement, her baby whimpered, and she shifted him, glancing up just as the man paused, turned, and met her eyes fully for the first time since the bidding. And in that moment something in her unraveled, not in fear, not in awe, but in something deeper, more disorienting, recognition, as if this man, whose name she didn't even know, had been carved into the edge of her life long before they'd ever crossed paths.
He said nothing, only nodded at the path beside him, inviting her to walk with him, not behind, and she obeyed without speaking, adjusting her baby and stepping beside him, close enough to hear the soft jingle of the beads at his belt but not close enough to touch, because she didn't trust anyone that much. Not yet. But as the dirt road curved into open plain and the buildings behind them became silhouettes, the tension in her shoulders loosened just slightly, enough for her to breathe without gasping, enough for her to feel the baby's breathing against her chest like a second heartbeat. And when they stopped to rest at a creek just past the tree line, he handed her a skin of water without a word, watching as she drank with trembling hands and let it spill down her neck and onto the baby's head, soothing him into sleep. And for the first time she dared to speak. "Why?" she asked, barely above a whisper, the single word trembling under the weight of everything it didn't ask. "Why me? Why now? Why risk yourself for someone already broken?" And the man looked at her, his face unreadable but not cold, and replied with the first word she'd heard from his lips. No one raised a hand, and it took her a moment to understand that he hadn't just meant at the auction, but ever, because people like her were always left unclaimed, unprotected, unseen, and that truth, spoken so simply, tore at her more than any insult ever had. They camped that night under a canopy of trees, the stars. blinking above like questions she couldn't answer, and as the fire crackled low and Thomas slept between them wrapped in his mother's shawl, she watched the man prepare food, move with quiet care, and when she asked his name, he answered after a pause, Toka, which meant firstborn in Lakota, and she repeated it under her breath like a promise, like a spell, not because she understood it, but because it gave shape to something she could no longer live without. This man, this silence, this mercy without motive. Sleep came harder for her that night, not from fear but from the weight of being allowed to rest, really rest, without threat or demand, and as her eyes fluttered closed, her last thought was not about escape or survival but about what came after, and whether a woman like her, who had been sold, branded, and nearly erased, could begin again not as someone's possession, but as someone's choice. The first time she stepped onto the land he called home, it was as if the world had shifted beneath her feet, less from the wind rolling down from the distant hills or the scent of sage thick in the air, and more from the absence of noise, of judgment, of that ever-present scrape of being watched like prey. And though the silence unnerved her at first, there was a gentler echo to it here, a kind of stillness that didn't press down on her shoulders but instead lifted something off her chest she hadn't realized she'd been carrying for years. The land was open, wild, and unlike any place she had ever seen. Soft grasses curled around her ankles as she walked, her baby bundled against her chest, the familiar weight of him now joined by a different kind of gravity. Awareness that she did not belong here, not really, and yet no one turned her away. Not the elders seated in the shade, not the women grinding corn, not the children who ran past with cautious glances, curiosity peeking through mistrust. And yet it was not unkindness that met her, but something older, something measured, as if they were waiting to see not if she was good, but if she would stay, if she would respect, if she would listen. Her skin, her hair, her voice, they marked her as outsider, and she felt it with every heartbeat, not like an accusation but like a reminder. You are walking on stories that are not yours, carry your steps gently, and so she did, saying little, watching much, learning to bow her head in greeting, to move slowly with the wind and not against it, to wait before asking questions, and still the whispers came, low, sharp, fluttering like insects. He brought back a white woman. She's not his wife. He gave her his family's necklace, and she didn't even bow. She's a ghost. And that last word stung deeper than the rest because she had felt like one for so long, walking unseen through a world that only noticed her when she was useful or in the way, and here, too, she realized they did not quite see her as a woman but as something between breath and absence. A shadow trailing behind a man whose silence was mistaken for consent. But Toka, he never spoke against them, nor did he defend her, and that confused her at first, made her wonder if she was merely a vessel he had saved out of ritual, not choice, until one night when the fire was low and Thomas had fallen asleep nestled in a wool cradle his mother didn't know how to name, she asked him directly, voice low and trembling, "Why did you give me that necklace?" And he looked at her with the same unreadable gaze he always wore, then turned to the fire and answered with a word she did not know, waited, then translated, "Remembrance," and she realized then that the gift was not for her, not entirely. It was for someone he had lost, a woman, a child, a family whose name she'd never know, and in offering it to her, he had laid down a piece of his grief, a piece of his past. Not because she reminded him of them, but because she, too, carried loss in her bones and silence in her breath. That night she could not sleep, haunted not by fear but by this truth. She was not being courted, not being loved, not even being protected in the way women were in stories. She had been seen, recognized, and in some fragile, unspoken way, chosen not for her beauty or purity or obedience but for her endurance, her refusal to break, her ability to carry a child through hell and still sing lullabies in cracked whispers. And though the others did not yet see her, did not understand why Toka brought her here, why he shared his food, his fire, his name without ownership, she began to see herself differently, not as a ghost but as a survivor learning how to return to her body, to her place in the world, to her child not just as a protector but as a mother who could finally be whole. In the days that followed, she joined the other women in gathering roots, in washing clothes by the river, her hands clumsy but her eyes open. And though no one spoke directly to her at first, one woman, a widow with deep lines and eyes like granite, pressed a small bundle into her arms without a word, moccasins for Thomas, stitched with care and not pity, and Grace. She was Grace again now, in her heart if not aloud. Cried not because she felt welcome but because she felt invited, like a door had creaked open and she could stand at its threshold, one bare foot inside. She still heard the whispers, still felt the weight of being other, but when she held her son at night and felt him smile in his sleep, when she watched Toka feed the fire without fanfare, When she stood beneath the stars and whispered, "Thank you," into the dark, she no longer felt like a ghost. She felt like someone learning, quietly, painfully, beautifully, how to live. It was the kind of revelation that didn't arrive like thunder or shouting, but like a slow, aching rain that soaked through everything before you even realized you were wet. Grace found the truth not from Toka himself, but from the widow with the granite eyes, the one who had handed her moccasins stitched with hands that had buried more than they had held. And it happened on a morning that had begun as most did,
with firelight and the low hum of tasks being done in rhythm with the sun. But there was a tension in the air, a shift in the way the women moved that day. And when Grace knelt beside the river to wash the child's blanket, the old woman came and sat beside her, not looking at her, just staring into the water as though it still spoke to her in the voice of her ancestors. And after a long silence she said, "You carry death." Not as accusation, but as fact, and Grace's fingers froze in the water, unsure whether to defend herself or listen. But the woman didn't pause, didn't soften, just continued. "The necklace he gave you, it belonged to his sister, Sani, who died in the raid on Wounded Horse Ridge, the last of his family taken by soldiers who called themselves righteous, who stormed the village under flags and fire, who left women screaming in snow and children buried without names. And he found the necklace clutched in Sani's fist when they uncovered the bodies." And Grace felt her breath catch. Her whole chest tightened like her ribs were being pulled inward by invisible thread, because she had worn that necklace like a gift, like a kindness. But now it burned on her skin, a holy thing she didn't deserve. And the woman turned to her then, eyes sharp but not cruel. "He gave it to you not because you are her, but because you too were taken, sold, broken. And because in you he sees a wound that does not ask for healing, but gives it." And then she stood, walked away, leaving Grace kneeling in the river with shaking hands and a blanket that now felt heavier than a mountain. And that night, she did not wear the necklace, instead placing it in the cradle beside Thomas, whispering to it as though it could hear, "I didn't know. I didn't know I was holding your story." And sleep did not come easy after that. When Toka returned from a 2-day hunt and saw the necklace resting beside the baby, he said nothing at first, just stood in the doorway, the fire casting his shadow long against the wall. And when she finally found the courage to speak, her voice cracked in the middle. "You should take it back. I can't wear it now, not after knowing." And he sat beside the fire and stared into it like the flames were decoding something he couldn't say aloud. And after what felt like hours he spoke, "It is not for me anymore." Then turned to her, eyes soft but lined with something older than grief. "When I saw you on that platform, with your child wrapped to your chest and your eyes already halfway gone, I saw her again." And he paused, breathing slow, deliberate, as though every word came at a cost. "I did not raise my hand to save you. I raised it because I could not save her." And the room filled with a silence that wasn't empty, but overflowing with unsaid things. Guilt, mourning, redemption, and something dangerously close to trust. Grace wanted to cry, not because she was sad, but because no one had ever told her the truth about their pain before, not like this. Not laid it bare like a map and said, "Here, this is where it hurts." And she leaned forward slowly, as if every inch was a test of her own worth, and placed her hand over his. Not romantically, not even affectionately, but like someone saying, "I see you too." And in that moment, two people who had been built from trauma and stitched together by silence began to understand something unspoken. That grief is not meant to be solved, only shared. And that maybe, just maybe, survival was not the end of the story, but the beginning. In the days that followed, the way she carried herself shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, but in quiet ways. She began to hum again when she rocked Thomas to sleep. She began to ask the elders questions with reverence, not fear. And she began to walk with her shoulders back, not because she felt strong, but because she was beginning to forgive herself for not breaking, for not disappearing when the world had tried so hard to erase her. The necklace remained near, sometimes around her neck, sometimes resting in Thomas's cradle, not as decoration, but as reminder, not of death, but of lineage, of memory, of the way pain can become protection when passed from one heart to another with care. And though the others still whispered, their words began to dull, not because they liked her now, but because they could no longer deny that she was staying. and more than that, that she belonged, not by birth or blood, but by bond, by choice, by a man who never raised his voice but had once raised his hand, and in doing so, shifted the course of not just her life, but his OWN.IT began not with grand gestures or declarations, but with the simple act of her laughing for the first time, sharp and short and unintentional, when Thomas reached for a bowl of berries and accidentally flung half of them into the fire, his tiny fingers sticky with juice and triumph, as if he'd just discovered magic. And though the sound startled even her, she didn't hide it, didn't look around to see who had heard. She just let it rise and fade and settle. And when she glanced up and saw Toka watching her, not smiling exactly, but softer somehow, his lips curved just slightly, and his gaze warm as the firelight between them, she didn't look away. That night, as Thomas slept curled like a question mark between folded blankets, and the cold began to creep down from the ridgeline, Toka placed an extra log on the fire and handed her a small carved whistle in the shape of a bird. Nothing was said, but the meaning was clear. A gesture, a gift, not one of obligation or exchange, but of shared space, of saying you belong here, and Grace held it like it might fly away if she loosened her grip. The days became a rhythm, Toka rising early to hunt or gather, Grace beginning to move through the village with quieter confidence, Thomas now walking unsteadily from her legs to Toka's outstretched arms, like a bridge slowly being built. And though they still lived in a separate tent, outside the family clusters, no longer did the children point, no longer did the elders turn their backs, and the widow who once gave her moccasins now offered silent nods of approval whenever their paths crossed. One evening, as the sky bled orange and Thomas fussed from teething, Grace instinctively began to sing.
Not loudly, not well, just a soft murmur of something half-remembered, a lullaby her mother had once hummed while braiding her hair on long evenings before the world hardened, and Toka, sitting nearby mending his boots, paused in his stitching and closed his eyes, letting the sound fill the tent like incense, holy and fleeting. Afterward, she expected awkwardness, silence, but instead he said quietly, "Sonny sang that too." And instead of shame, she felt something like gratitude, a thread tying past to present, grief to peace. Over time, the language between them became more than words. Grace began learning Lakota, one word at a time, first from the children who found delight in teaching her the wrong ones just to see her confusion, then from Toka, who would speak slowly, patiently, and repeat without irritation when she asked again and again. She learned how to say, "Safe, Wastika," "Mother," "Ina," and eventually, "Thank you, Pilamea," which she said often, not because she was expected to, but because every day something small was being returned to her. Her dignity, her voice, her right to feel joy. The turning point came one night during a gathering around the central fire where stories were shared, not told, but lived, passed on like offerings through voice and drum and dance. And when someone asked who the child belonged to, Grace felt every eye turn toward her, and for the first time, she did not flinch, did not shrink. She simply lifted Thomas into her lap and said, in her broken accent but with unwavering strength, "He is mine." And the silence that followed wasn't judgmental, it was reverent, and then the elder storyteller nodded and said, "Then you are one of us." And though no ceremony followed, though no title was placed on her, Grace felt something shift in the earth beneath her feet, as if the land itself had accepted her. That night, she and Toka sat beneath the stars, not touching, not speaking, just breathing together as the firelight danced across their skin, and finally, she turned to him and asked, "Do you still see her when you look at me?" And he looked at her long and deep before answering, "No, I see you now." And that sentence settled into her chest like a heartbeat, and when she finally lay down to sleep beside her son, she did so without fear, without shame, and with a whistle tucked beneath her pillow, not as a tool, but as a totem, a reminder that sometimes healing is not loud, not immediate, but slow, like fire warming bone, like a name finding its voice again under the weight of survival, and that even a woman who once believed herself unsalvageable can, under the right light, remember how to glow. It had been nearly 5 moons since she had last seen the sheriff's face, but when his horse appeared on the ridge and his hat tilted back to reveal the familiar sneer beneath pale eyes and a mustache too well kept for a man so dirty, Grace knew instantly that peace, however sacred, was never permanent. Not when the world she came from could still send men like him into the silence she had fought so hard to protect. She was in the garden when she saw him, hands deep in the soil planting late autumn greens while Thomas toddled near the fence line with a stick in one hand and a beetle in the other, and for a moment, everything stopped, her breath, her heart, the wind around her, and all she could hear was the crunch of hooves and the low rasp of a voice she had once begged not to sell her to the highest bidder, but who had laughed and said, "You ain't even worth the highest." By the time she stood, Toka was already moving, calm but direct, stepping between the garden and the trail as if his very body could repel the past, and Grace wiped her hands on her skirt, scooped up Thomas, and walked slowly toward the fire circle where elders had already begun to gather, their eyes narrowing at the intrusion. The sheriff dismounted like he owned the land, his boots kicking up dust like accusation, and in his hand was a folded letter sealed in red wax, the kind used not for correspondence, but commands. "I've come for the girl," he said, not even looking at her. Directly, just tossing the words into the space like garbage, and the crowd murmured, their language a wall she couldn't understand but fell humming in her bones like a warning. Toka didn't flinch, didn't speak, only stared until the sheriff added, "She's still property. Law says she ran with a child that doesn't belong to her man, and there's a buyer waitin' in Dakota with double the price we got for her last time." And that word, property, hit harder than any slap, not because it was new, but because she had worked so hard to forget it, to erase the echo of being less than human, and now it came back with paperwork and a signature. She stepped forward then, voice low but unshaken. "That child is mine, and you'll call me by my name, Grace." And for a brief moment, the sheriff actually blinked, thrown by her stance, by the clarity in her eyes, and then he chuckled. "Doesn't matter what name you go by, sweetheart. Court order says you come with me, or you'll be taken." And that was when Toka stepped between them, his body no longer just protection but protest, and the sheriff looked up at him and sneered, "You gonna stand in front of the law now?" And Toka's answer was one sentence, spoken not in anger but in warning. "There is no law here that protects men like you." And the sheriff grinned, handed over the letter to the eldest among them, and said, "Then we'll see what your kind thinks when the judge rides in next week. Trial's been filed, and she'll get her chance to whimper." Then mounted his horse and turned without waiting for a reply, leaving behind silence broken only by the crinkle of parchment being unfolded by weathered hands. The elder read slowly, translating aloud. A claim of abandonment, of theft, of fraud. Document signed by Grace's father, backed by the man who had once promised to marry her, who now declared her insane and unfit, who claimed Thomas as unlawfully born, and Toka as a corrupting influence. And as the words echoed around her, Grace felt the fire inside her grow not wild, but sharp, like a blade tempered in ash. She stood taller, even as Thomas clung to her neck, and said, "Then let them come." And Toka placed his hand gently on her shoulder, not as owner, not as shield, but as anchor. The days that followed were quiet only on the surface. Preparations began not for battle but for testimony. Stories gathered. Elders asked to recall what they had witnessed. Documents translated and transcribed. And a young boy who had once drawn pictures of Grace with Thomas under a tree now drew a new image.
Of her standing before a judge with her baby in her arms and the sun behind her head like a halo. She did not hide anymore, did not walk the edge of camp as if fearing exile. She stood with the other women at the cooking fire, spoke at council gatherings in her halting Lakota, even visited the storyteller, who helped her rehearse the words she would use when the time came to speak for herself, for her son, for all the women who had been sold in silence and buried in reputation. And at night when Thomas slept and the stars burned above them, Toka would sit beside her and say nothing, because she no longer needed him to carry her grief. She had learned how to hold it without letting it consume her. When the judge arrived, it was with 2 armed riders and a Bible thicker than the books Grace had used to teach herself how to read. And the courtroom was not a grand hall, but a barn repurposed, swept and lined with benches and faces, hers among them, unflinching. The sheriff wore his badge like a shield, but Grace wore her son like armor. And when the proceedings began, she stepped forward not as a victim, but as a witness, ready to tell a story the law never expected to hear from a girl they once priced like cattle. The barn-turned courtroom was thick with heat and breath, and the low hum of barely restrained bias. A place where justice was supposed to be neutral, but hung crooked on the wall, like a cross nailed sideways. And as Grace sat at the far bench with Thomas in her lap, his fingers playing with the hem of her shawl, she could feel the weight of every gaze in that room. The judge, imported from a nearby county, wearing spectacles and impatience. The sheriff, lounging with smug certainty as if the verdict had already been written. And a collection of townsfolk, traders, missionaries, and landowners, most of whom came not to see justice served, but to watch a Lakota man stand trial for the audacity of raising his hand to save a white woman when no one else did. And That's what this was, not officially, not by name, but by implication. A trial of Toka, not for a crime, but for a defiance, for an act of humanity that had bruised the egos of the men who saw women like Grace as things, not people, and saw native men like Toka as shadows, not citizens. The judge began with the documents, the contract of sale signed by her father, the bounty issued by the man who once called himself her fiancé, and a sworn statement from the sheriff claiming that Grace was mentally unwell, known to wander, and had been misled by a tribal outsider into fleeing her rightful obligations. Grace's fists clenched, her jaw tight, as she waited for the moment they would allow her to speak. But it was Toka who rose first, not because he was called, but because he knew waiting for permission from a system built to silence you was a form of surrender. And when he stood, the room shifted, not out of respect, but confusion, because men like him weren't supposed to stand to speak, to exist on equal footing. And yet he did, tall, centered, gaze steady as the judge raised an eyebrow and said, "You're not being charged, sir." And Toka replied, voice quiet but unshakable, "I am always charged." And in that moment, even the murmur stopped. He spoke simply, without embellishment, of what he saw that day at the auction block, of the way the crowd jeered at a mother and her child, of how no one, not a single man with gold in his pocket or law on his chest, had raised a hand for her. And then, as if it cost him nothing, he unhooked the small medicine pouch at his belt, opened it slowly, and withdrew a folded piece of cloth that he placed on the judge's bench. Inside, a pressed sprig of wild lavender, the first plant Grace had nurtured on his land, and beside it, a drawing Thomas had made of Mama, me, and Toka, crude but full of joy. And though Toka said nothing else, the judge stared at the contents longer than anyone expected, then cleared his throat and said, "Very well, let the woman speak." And Grace rose, her knees trembling only slightly as she stood with her son still in her arms, walked forward, and placed herself where no one had ever wanted her to be, center stage, under oath, unbroken. She told her story plainly, not as performance, but as proof, how she was sold, how she ran, how she begged to keep her baby from being taken like her future already had been, and how no one stopped to help her until a man, without words, raised his hand, not to claim her, not to buy her, but to interrupt the world that had already written her ending. Her voice cracked once, when she spoke of how Thomas cried at night in that storage room, how she tore pieces of her dress to keep him dry. But she did not falter, did not beg, only finished with a sentence that felt older than her own life. "If saving a woman like me is a crime, then the law never wanted me to live." And with that, she returned to her seat, placed Thomas beside her, and waited. The sheriff scoffed, rose, and tried to argue that the baby wasn't legally hers, that there were no papers proving maternity or fitness or guardianship, and that the child should be removed and placed into appropriate custody. But the courtroom had turned, ever so slightly, eyes shifting, hearts cracking, as what once sounded like order now began to sound like control. And just then, before the judge could speak, the old widow stood from the back row, slowly, deliberately, and said in a voice that shook the rafters, "I've watched that girl grow into her name, watched that man show more decency than this room has ever known, and I tell you now, if you take that baby from her, you'll have to go through every woman here who's ever been told she doesn't matter." And one by one, the women stood, Lakota, white mixed, some with babies, some with scars, some with nothing but will. And though they said nothing else, their standing said enough. The judge looked out, then down, then finally returned to the bench, tapped his gavel softly, and said, "There's no law more binding than the truth we've seen today. The claim is denied. The child stays with his mother, and this court is adjourned." And just like that, the tension broke, not with cheers or clapping, but with breath, the long-held breath of a woman who had waited her whole life to be heard. And as Grace turned to Toka, she didn't smile, didn't cry. She simply nodded, a gesture deeper than thanks, older than victory, the kind of nod two warriors give when they realize they have survived something sacred together. And as the townsfolk filed out, whispering now not about shame, but about strength, Thomas reached up, tugged on Toka's sleeve, and said, for the first time in a full sentence, "You're my Toka. And the man, who had once buried his sister and thought he'd buried his heart with her, bent down, touched the boy's head, and said softly, "And you are my thunder." The barn emptied slowly that afternoon, not with celebration but with reverence, as if those who had gathered understood that something rare had just unfolded, not a legal victory in the traditional sense, but a kind of spiritual correction, something deeper than law, something older than ink and signatures, had been honored when the judge set down his gavel and let truth speak louder than heritage, louder than power. And as Grace stepped out into the light with Thomas on her hip and Toka beside her, the air felt heavier not with burden but with meaning. Like every breath they drew now held weight, and yet neither of them said anything for a long time, not even as the widow walked past and nodded again.
Her approval no longer cautious but certain. Grace didn't know what to do with the sudden quiet. Not silence, but the hush that follows a storm, the kind of hush where flowers begin to open and the soil still remembers being struck. So she sat under a cottonwood tree near the river while Thomas toddled in circles, and she let the wind touch her face and thought of all the places her voice had never been allowed to go, and how now it had gone everywhere, had filled a barn with something holy and furious, and no one could ever take that back. People came one by one, not with apologies, but offerings. A small basket of berries from a girl she'd never spoken to, a blanket from a grandmother who once turned her back, and most powerfully, a drum, gifted by a young mother with a scar across her collarbone who simply said, "You gave me permission," and when Grace asked what for, the woman smiled and said, "To remember my name," before turning and disappearing into the dusk. Toka didn't say much, didn't need to, but that night as they sat by the fire, he brought the drum out and handed it to her, and when she hesitated, he said only, "Your voice is bigger than your throat," and she understood that this wasn't a gift to play, it was a gift to feel. And so, slowly, hesitantly, she placed her hand on the drumskin and struck once, the sound deep and round, a heartbeat echoing outward like a pulse rippling through the dark, and Thomas clapped, then laughed, and suddenly everything felt warmer, felt whole. In the days that followed, Grace noticed how the town had shifted, not completely, not in every corner, but in ways that mattered. A merchant who once refused her now nodded politely, a girl at the well offered to braid her hair, and at the weekly market, no one dared use the word ghost anymore. The sheriff, though still present, now kept his distance, his threats hollowed by the sound of women standing and a child calling a Lakota man Toka like it meant father. And though Grace knew the world would never fully erase its hunger for cruelty, she also knew that something had been interrupted. Some cycle had been cracked, and through that crack, light was pouring in. One evening, during a gathering by the fire, the drum was passed to her again, and this time she didn't hesitate. She struck it 3 times, slow and steady, and then spoke a sentence in Lakota she had spent weeks rehearsing, her accent clumsy but her intention clear. "Midikui oyazang," and the circle answered in kind, not because she was fluent, but because she had tried, and trying was the language of healing. Later, when she and Toka returned to their tent and Thomas slept with one hand clutching the corner of the drum blanket, she asked softly, "Is it always like this? The fight?" And Toka, after a long pause, answered, "No, but the memory of it is," and she thought about that for a long time, thought about how survival leaves echoes in your spine, how safety is not the absence of fear but the ability to live despite it, and how she had finally begun to build something that could not be sold, could not be signed away. And so, under a sky thick with stars, she made a quiet promise to herself, not to forget, not to forgive too easily, but to grow a life so rooted in truth that even the wind could not move it. And when Thomas stirred in his sleep and murmured, "Mama," she whispered back, "Yes, my heart," because now there was no one left to question if he was hers, not the law, not the whispers, not even the shadows that once ruled her thoughts. And somewhere in the distance, a drumbeat echoed faintly across the hills, steady and sure, as if the land itself had cast its vote and chosen her. The barn emptied slowly that afternoon, not with celebration but with reverence, as if those who had gathered understood that something rare had just unfolded, not a legal victory in the traditional sense, but a kind of spiritual correction. Something deeper than law, something older than ink and signatures, had been honored when the judge set down his gavel and let truth speak louder than heritage, louder than power. And as Grace stepped out into the light with Thomas on her hip and Toka beside her, the air felt heavier not with burden but with meaning. Like every breath they drew now held weight, and yet neither of them said anything for a long time, not even as the widow walked past and nodded again, her approval no longer cautious but certain. Grace didn't know what to do with the sudden quiet. Not silence, but the hush that follows a storm, the kind of hush where flowers begin to open and the soil still remembers being struck. So she sat under a cottonwood tree near the river while Thomas toddled in circles, and she let the wind touch her face and thought of all the places her voice had never been allowed to go, and how now it had gone everywhere, had filled a barn with something holy and furious, and no one could ever take that back. People came one by one, not with apologies, but offerings. A small basket of berries from a girl she'd never spoken to, a blanket from a grandmother who once turned her back, and most powerfully, a drum, gifted by a young mother with a scar across her collarbone who simply said, "You gave me permission," and when Grace asked what for, the woman smiled and said, "To remember my name," before turning and disappearing into the dusk. Toka didn't say much, didn't need to, but that night as they sat by the fire, he brought the drum out and handed it to her, and when she hesitated, he said only, "Your voice is bigger than your throat," and she understood that this wasn't a gift to play, it was a gift to feel, and so, slowly, hesitantly, she placed her hand on the drumskin and struck once, the sound deep and round, a heartbeat echoing outward like a pulse rippling through the dark, and Thomas clapped, then laughed, and suddenly everything felt warmer, felt whole. In the days that followed, Grace noticed how the town had shifted. Not completely, not in every corner, but in ways that mattered. A merchant who once refused her now nodded politely, a girl at the well offered to braid her hair, and at the weekly market, no one dared use the word ghost anymore. The sheriff, though still present, now kept his distance, his threats hollowed by the sound of women standing and a child calling a Lakota man Toka like it meant father, and though Grace knew the world would never fully erase its hunger for cruelty, she also knew that something had been interrupted. Some cycle had been cracked, and through that crack, light was pouring in. One evening, during a gathering by the fire, the drum was passed to her again, and this time she didn't hesitate.
She struck it 3 times, slow and steady, and then spoke a sentence in Lakota she had spent weeks rehearsing, her accent clumsy, but her intention clear. "Midikioeze," and the circle answered in kind, not because she was fluent, but because she had tried, and trying was the language of healing. Later, when she and Toka returned to their tent and Thomas slept with one hand clutching the corner of the drum blanket, she asked softly, "Is it always like this? The fight?" And Toka, after a long pause, answered, "No, but the memory of it is." And she thought about that for a long time, thought about how survival leaves echoes in your spine, how safety is not the absence of fear, but the ability to live despite it, and how she had finally begun to build something that could not be sold, could not be signed away. And so, under a sky thick with stars, she made a quiet promise to herself, not to forget, not to forgive too easily, but to grow a life so rooted in truth that even the wind could not move it. And when Thomas stirred in his sleep and murmured, "Mama," she whispered back, "Yes, my heart," because now there was no one left to question if he was hers, not the law, not the whispers, not even the shadows that once ruled her thoughts. And somewhere in the distance, a drumbeat echoed faintly across the hills, steady and sure, as if the land itself had cast its vote and chosen her. There was no ribbon-cutting or public declaration the day. They moved into the house they had built beam by beam, just the hush of sunrise slipping through new windows, and the smell of cedar still fresh in the walls as Anna, no longer Grace, not in name, not in posture, stepped through the doorway holding Thomas's hand while Toka held a carved box in his, the one that had once carried Sani's necklace and now carried a braid of sweetgrass, a stone from the creek, and a bundle of lavender tied with Anna's own thread. And as they crossed the threshold together, it was not ceremony they entered. It was arrival, the long-awaited moment where survival became something permanent, not frantic. And the home they had dreamed of in murmurs and sweat finally stood solid beneath their feet. The house was not large, but every inch carried intention. The cradle beside the hearth made from the wood of the first tree Toka felled after the trial, the shelf that held Thomas's drawings in smudged charcoal, the windows placed so that the morning sun fell directly onto the kitchen floor where Anna had once danced without music, just to feel her feet claim space again. Outside, the field had grown, no longer just lavender, but corn, squash, even sunflowers, tall and grinning, stretching toward the sky like children that refused to bend. And each day began not with fear, but with rhythm. Thomas's small feet on the porch, Anna's hands in the garden, Toka's voice humming songs only the land understood. Their family was not defined by paper or church. vows, but by labor and laughter, and the sound of Thomas saying "our home" in his sleep. And though they did not call themselves husband and wife, though they did not wear rings or hold titles, the bond between them was visible in the way Anna handed Toka his tools without needing to be asked, in the way he placed his hand on her lower back when passing behind her, a gesture of respect, not claim, and in the way Thomas often reached for both their hands at once when he wanted to show them something he'd found, a leaf, a worm, a thought, because in his small, growing world, family was not defined by what had been taken, but by what had been chosen. The neighbors began to change too, slowly, tentatively. First a shared meal, then help raising a barn wall, then an invitation to a community feast where Anna was asked to bring her stew and Toka was asked to drum, and though old prejudices lingered in glances and pauses, they were no longer sharp, just relics softening under new stories. And the children born into that land would grow up knowing that a white woman and a Lakota man had built something from ashes that could shelter them all. One evening, as twilight settled and the stars began their slow bloom across the dark, Anna sat on the porch with her journal open, a gift from the widow who had first seen her not as a ghost, but as a girl worth standing for. And she wrote not about the trial, not about the pain, but about the quiet, the way Thomas laughed when water splashed, his boots, the sound of Toka sharpening his knife against stone, the smell of bread rising in their clay oven. And as she wrote, she realized this was her bloodline now, not just the baby she had carried through fear and fire, but the stories, the soil, the shelter she was giving him every day. And when she finished writing, she stood, walked barefoot into the field, and whispered the names of the women who had not made it, Sonny, her own mother, the girls from the shack, who had never been named, and planted a single wildflower for each, saying not prayers, but promises. Later that night, when the fire had died and the house held only breath and dreams, Toka reached across the space between them and touched her hand, murmuring, "You built this." And she whispered back, "So did you." Because the truth was they had survived, yes, but more than that, they had created, chosen, and claimed, and in doing so, they had carved a new bloodline not from lineage, but from love. Years later, when the land had shifted through seasons, and the house stood weathered but unshaken, when the lavender had returned each spring thicker and wilder and more determined than before, when the lines around Anna's eyes had deepened not with sorrow but with story, and when Thomas, no longer small, no longer chasing beetles, but tall, strong, and carrying his own shadow with gentleness, stood at the edge of the same garden where his mother once hid from the sheriff's dust, he looked out over the fields and saw, not just crops, but roots, not just fences, but history, and behind him, the sound of a single drumbeat echoed across the porch where Toka, now slower in his step, but not in his spirit, sat watching the horizon like he always had, and Anna stood in the doorway with flour on her hands and the scent of fire in her hair, the same way she had the first time she ever fed Toka something warm and healing. The drumbeat was not ceremonial now, it was familiar, domestic, woven into the rhythm of days and seasons, struck each evening not for show, but to remind the wind, we are still here. And on that day, as Thomas lifted the same drum that had once been given to his mother by a scarred woman with eyes like glass and courage like steel, he played not the old rhythm, but a new one, slightly offbeat, faster, younger, a rhythm that belonged only to him, and yet carried in it echoes of every moment that had shaped him, the cold silence of a courtroom, the hush of his mother's voice in the dark, the sound of feet crossing a border no one else had dared walk. Anna listened from the kitchen, paused her kneading, and let the tears fall not from sadness, but from the unbearable softness of survival, because this was what she had wanted all along, not justice carved into marble, not apologies from men who would never mean them, but this, a son who could play freely on land no one could take, a home where no name was forbidden, a life that hummed with its own kind of holiness, and Toka, leaning forward with elbows on knees and hands folded, watched Thomas with eyes that had once witnessed loss upon loss and now held nothing but light. And when the boy stopped drumming and looked over, Toka gave him a nod.
Silent, strong, the same one he once gave Anna outside a courtroom before the world learned her name was worth remembering. As dusk settled over the fields and the light began to change, Anna stepped onto the porch, leaned against the railing, and for a long moment, The three of them stood in the kind of silence that needs no words, only presence, and when Thomas finally broke it by asking, "Do you think they hear us?" Meaning the women who came before, the ones whose names were now buried in the soil, the ones whose stories ended in silence. Anna replied not with speech, but by picking up the drum herself, striking it once, gently, the sound rolling through the hills like thunder and mercy entwined, and said simply, "They always have," and in that moment, where the drumbeat ended, legacy began, not in courts or ledgers or legends, but in the steady hands of a boy who would never know the auction block, in the soft footsteps of a woman who no longer trembled when she entered a room, in the quiet strength of a man who once raised his hand not to fight, but to save, and in the land, listening, always listening, holding them all like a promise fulfilled.